This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a political scientist at Tel Aviv and Princeton universities, and the author of a new book entitled The Mortality and Morality of Nations, that has recently been published in English by Cambridge University Press. The book explores how existential angst, a rather ubiquitous and normal psychological condition, has permeated into the collective level by looking at three cases of endangered nations, in inverted commas: French Canadians, Afrikaners and Jewish Israelis. Dr. Uriel Abulof, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
So, mortality and morality, it's more than just a fortunate play on words. What's really the link between the two?
Fortunate or unfortunate, considering how close they are. Well, I've been thinking about this issue for many years now, and for me, what strikes me as a sort of causality even between the two is that in many cases, mortality propels us to seek morality, both on the individual level and the collective level.
How so?
Individually, we all know that we are mortal. At a certain age, usually at the age of 5 or 6, kids already know that they are bound to die. It's a very stark realization for many of us. And as we come to terms with the fact that we are mortal, we are in a constant search for something to anchor ourselves in. A sort of a symbolic immortality, if you will. And that symbolic immortality is imbued with meaning. Often enough, we search that meaning in morality, that categorization of good and bad.
What do you mean exactly by morality?
That categorization of good and bad. Often enough, we think about morality in terms of goodness, virtuousness. This is not what I refer to. And this is also why I am fully willing to accept the possibility of, say, Nazi morality, to the extent to which they believe that they hold the good versus the bad or the evil in that regard. And again, this is, like our awareness of our own mortality, a unique human trait. Only us, human, think in categories of good and evil. Only we, human, are aware of our own mortality. And what I try to examine in this book is the way that the two interplay, especially on the collective level.
Mm-hmm. Is it to fill our lives with some sort of meaning? Is that really the thing here?
Meaning, but part of a larger vocation, an attempt to try and anchor the transient existence in a transcendence, collective existence, to anchor what is bound to pass into something that is outlasting. It comes from time that is almost immemorial and perhaps will be perpetual. And the nation, in that regard, feel a certain capacity. By the way, nation is not the only thing.
Exactly. How is it different from religion,
right,
or the family or any other kind of collective that we see around us?
So we can easily think of civilization, of religions, of tribes, of states, and indeed of nations as these sort of collectives that provide the symbolic immortality and the moral meaning. Often enough, we can find it in our own individual life, in our family. Now, what is interesting for me is the way that we perceive the web of various, what I call koizasoi, that is a certain anchors of meanings that we often enough find we are able to accommodate all, but sometimes we feel like we have to choose. Sometimes we feel like one is not doing a sufficient good job, and we have to move on to another sort of symbolic immortality. Mm-hmm. And perhaps these are the cases that I've investigated.
So is there anything uniquely modern in your inquiry? I mean, by focusing on the nation, which is, at the end of the day, a modern phenomenon. How is it different from other, perhaps more long-lasting forms of collectivity?
There is a big debate in the study of nationalism about when is the nation. It's a classical question in the study of nationalism, and there are usually two camps. Or at least depicted as two almost binary camps. One is the primordial or perennial school, which says that basically nations are antique, certainly pre-modern, and the modernists who obviously argue that nations are modern. What I'm suggesting in this book is that it is basically a question of stipulative definition. And the key question is, how do we define the nation? If we merely define the nation as simply rejecting foreign rule, then it is clearly a pre-modern phenomenon. We already see these kind of communities that reject whomever they consider to be the other already before modernity. If, however, we consider nationalism and the nation itself as a self-determining people, that is, that they consider the people to be the source of moral authority, then this is almost clearly a modern phenomenon. The question of popular sovereignty, of self-determination comes to play, and this is something that you see mostly since the 19th century onwards.
Okay, which is really the more powerful or influential for the purposes of your exploration, that is, to counter mortality.
Right, and partly because I was interested in the moral dimension of nationalism, right? I was interested in trying to figure out how do people make moral sense of their nation? How was the nation a sort of a framework to be used in order to make moral sense of the world around us? And by saying that, look, it's not the God above, but we the people who have the right to tell right from wrong in the public sphere, people were posing themselves as the anchor of morality. Now, there is a tremendous burden that comes along with that, because if you are the source of right and wrong, it also means that other people around you have the same rights, the same prerogative. And if they do not recognize you as holding the truth, as holding what is right, then you are in a predicament.
Is it a conscious process, by the way? Do people realize that they're defining right from wrong in the context of a national collective?
All that I can offer is what I can see on a conscious level. And what I mainly try to do in this book is to trace behavior and discourses. Now, if people are debating the issue, if they strictly relate to the question of morality, then clearly it's in their conscious. To what extent, even if it is outside that kind of articulated context, it's still in their mind, it's very hard for me to say.
Okay, and let's talk about the 3 case studies that you explore at length in the book. As we said, French Canadians, white South Africans, the Afrikaners, and Jewish Israelis. Why these 3? Do they have anything in common at all?
I didn't expect them to. I started with the case of the Israeli Jews. I guess that's for me what propelled the investigation of that case study, which is the main case study in the book, was the Second Intifada, the eruption of the Second Intifada in 2000, and the sense that many of my peers, both students and teachers at the time, spoke in a way that cast a certain doubt on the viability of the Jewish state. We looked at what happened all around us, and many of us started to wonder if this grand project, that grand project of Zionism, is indeed enduring one. So I started to investigate the Israeli Jewish case. I wanted to figure out to what extent that collectivity, the Jewish collectivity, and specifically the Israeli Jewish collectivity, provide to the people that symbolic immortality that I mentioned before. And the more I investigated the case of the Israeli Jews, the more I became intrigued by the phenomenon itself. And I was wondering to what extent it can also indicate a larger issue. And I was trying to go for cases that were not obvious. And for me, the least obvious case was indeed that of the French Canadian. And
what would be an obvious case?
An obvious case would be a case such as the Armenians. Right, you have basically a genocide, at least in their own perception. It's a very small community, a very troubled political history. You can see the corollaries here quite starkly. I didn't expect to find anything like that in the case of the French Canadian, mainly because of the lack of substantial violence. Right? I still remember the first time that I visited Montreal and Quebec, and I remember waking up in the morning to a newspaper, and on the front cover of the newspaper, all you see is the face of a baby. And on his nose was a butterfly. His or her nose is a butterfly. So that was the front page of a leading newspaper in Quebec. And obviously for me it was contrasted to what I find in Israel.
Exactly. How's that for symbolic immortality?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this will be, because of its benign political environment, relatively benign political environment, I did not expect to find this kind of existential anxieties in the way that, in the case of Israeli Jews, were almost obvious. In a sense, It's an odd thing to
Well, what
say,
do you
but-
mean exactly by existential anxieties in the case of the French Canadians? I mean, in Israel, we know that, Jews think that the national project wouldn't last for much longer. I mean, again, there's the whole question of security, physical security.
Right.
But what is it in Canada? How does this existential insecurity manifest itself?
Right. So perhaps I should make two distinctions that are of some importance here. One is that I'm not necessarily speaking about negative certainty about your existence, but about uncertainty, right? You can have positive certainty, saying that, for example, Israel would live forever, right? One possibility. Another would be a negative certainty, saying that Israel is doomed. What I was especially interested is that place in between, right? The uncertainty, the existential uncertainty. Now, when we think about the Canadian, one of the peculiar aspects is the fact that uncertainty can be both about the future and about the past. Now, for us Israeli Jews, uncertainty about the past doesn't really make a lot of sense, existentially speaking, right? When we raise those kind of questions, it's usually about the viability of our polity, of the national, ethno-national Jewish state.
Exactly. The past makes much more sense to us than sometimes the
Right.
present.
I mean,
As they say, the Jordan River has much more history than water.
Exactly, right? It's an historical people. Even if the Jewish people was invented, as part of the story goes, and in a sense, all nations, all peoples are socially constructed, invented. We've been through that in scholarship for sufficient time. What is important is the subjective dimension. For most Israeli Jews, there is no question in their mind that they are both Israelis and Jews. There is that ongoing question that is often posed in public opinion polls: are you more Israeli or Jewish? That's all very nice, but most people would argue that they are both. And it's a question of ranking, which is more important in their own life, right? So the past is almost a given in terms of this is who we are, and we can see our link from the present to the past. What we keep on wondering about, whether that kind of construction, politically speaking, will outlast us sufficiently, right? Whether you'll see Israel as a Jewish state here in, say, the next 50 years, a century or so. So this is obvious enough for us Israeli Jews. What is less obvious is existential uncertainty about identity. And this is what I found most remarkable about the case of the French Canadian. Now, think about the very term French Canadian. Most French Canadians today don't really call themselves French Canadians, right? What is the term that they use?
Quebecois.
Quebecois, exactly. And this is not where they started, even French Canadian. They started as French, coming from France to what we now call Canada. After becoming a source of a unique ethnic community, they call themselves the Canadiens, right? The name Canadians is originally a French one. But then, of course, the English are coming, taking over Canada, so now it's hard to call yourself Canadien and still remain distinct. So now you juxtapose those English Canadians to what you call French Canadians. And you still refer to that as an ethnic community. And for a century, not merely ethnic, but a race in it by itself. The leaders, the public, saw themselves as truly a race.
But also they see themselves as part of a bigger structure, which is the state of Canada.
Right, but there is an ongoing tension, and many thought that they should not be loyal to the state, but first and foremost to the ethnic or linguistic ethnic community. Now, one of the most remarkable upheaval is that of the 1960s, the Quiet Revolution, the secularization that was so rapid. And in a matter of a generation, you see people eschewing, rejecting that ethnic denotation. French Canadianness began to be almost a kind of a moral aberration. You have to put that aside, and you have to move on forward to what is now a linguistic, patriotic, Quebecois identity that's supposed to be much more inclusive. And it's a kind of a moral project.
So really their project is to a constant search for outlets for their identity.
To see themselves as not only a viable polity, but a valid identity. And for that reason, the ongoing moral tension, they fashion and refashion again and again and again their own identity. Now, think about it. What are the cases do we know worldwide of communities that time after time, voluntarily, right? Not because of an imposition from the outside, voluntarily refashion itself, the core of its identity and its own name. And, you might know about the referendum done in Quebec in 1995. It was the second referendum
The
about whether or not,
independence, yeah.
whether or not Quebec should become independent. the vote was eventually, very marginally so, against independence, although the majority of the French Canadian or the Quebecois voted in favor of that. And Parisot, the premier at the time, said that it was because of the money and the ethnic vote. Right? Now, what is remarkable is that a day after that speech, he had to resign. And he had to resign because the Quebecois told him, we don't want anything to do with ethnicity. We are not an ethnic community, which is the exact opposite of what the forefather used to say about themselves.
Right.
And they have voluntarily said ethnicity, and let alone ethno-nationalism, is bad, morally flawed.
Right. Let's now go to South Africa, to the Afrikaners.
Okay.
Again, it's also a very interesting case study because they had their own way of asserting their identity, their sovereignty, that due to the political circumstances had to be abandoned.
Yep.
How did that change things for them?
Yeah. And in a sense, comparing Israeli Jews to Afrikaners shouldn't be that surprising. There are several articles and books that juxtapose South Africa to Israel. However, most of those books are, in a sense, politically laden. Right? And we have that, what I think is academically, intellectually not viable analogy between apartheid and Zionism. But what is remarkable about the case of the Afrikaners is that they had uncertainty, existential uncertainty, about both their identity and polity. At the start of their emergence as a community, you see many analogies between what I told you about the case of the French Canadian and what we see in the case of the Afrikaners. But from the beginning of the 20th century, they become increasingly more like Israeli Jews, like Zionists, in the sense that most of their existential uncertainty was about the future of their polity. We obviously have the Second Boer War, in which they have lost tremendously. And they're regarded as a sort, if we want to find an equivalent, as a sort of a Holocaust of their own. And in their collective memory, this is a painful reminder of how small they are. In the book, I keep referring to...
So basically, the interlocutor, in this sense, are the British, not the black Africans.
Well, both, but it changes over time. Right? A very momentous point in their history in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, is the Great Trek, in which they moved into the hinterland, running away from British control in the southern part, but also confronting themselves with the non-white of South Africa again and again. True enough, up until the 1940s, 50s, but even more so 60s, their significant other was predominantly the English of South Africa. That, like the case of the French Canadian, and also to a certain extent, like the case of Israel or Palestine, was taken over by the British Empire. But from the 50s, and especially since the 60s, when the Afrikaners managed to assert themselves politically and establish what they call Afrikanerdom, right, the rise of the National Party in 1948, perhaps symbolically enough in that regard, the British threat, the English threat, is subsiding, and what becomes much more manifested is what they regarded as the black danger, the black menace. And indeed, they regarded that existentially.
Doesn't it? I mean, they're a tiny minority amid a hostile majority.
Of course. And here again, you see equivalence between those cases, right? Because in a certain context, they were a majority. Like Israeli Jews are a majority in Israel itself. Like the French Canadians or the Quebecois are a majority in Quebec itself, the province of Quebec. And in the minds of the Afrikaners, and surely enough in numbers themselves, they were majority among the whites of South Africa. But then when you extend that context in Israel to the whole land of Israel or the Great Palestine, in the case of the French Canadian to Canada, in the case of the Afrikaners to whole of South Africa, they become a minority. And that minority becomes even tinier when you think about the larger regional context, the Middle East, North America, and Africa, right? In all of those circles, they become a lesser and lesser minority.
But the Afrikaners have voluntarily given up their privilege, their power, as it were, their state power. If there was really a case of debilitating, paralyzing existential angst, that wouldn't have happened, right?
Now, this is a very interesting angle to it. I mentioned that before, that one of the things that fascinated me is the sense of choice, of freedom, right? We have various projects of perpetuity, if you like, right? Various projects in which we can immerse ourselves, those symbolic immortalities. One key question that lingers in my mind when I investigated those cases and others was to what extent the communities themselves believed that they have a choice, that they have the freedom to choose between various projects, such political projects. Now, what is very clear in the case of the French Canadian and the Afrikaners, the deeper you get into them, is that they increasingly believe that they have sufficient degrees of freedom to opt out and still survive. That is, in the case of the Afrikaners, that existential anxiety increasingly became a question about our standards of living, not about our very own survival. And perhaps they started to wonder, our survival as a community, as a people, would be better served outside the problematic moral metrics of apartheid. So they opted out. In the same way, about identity, that the French Canadians have done. Right? Mm-hmm. Opting out of their French Canadianness, the ethnic French Canadianness, to the Quebecois identity.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't seen that in the case of Israeli Jews.
And even if we will at some point, I mean, I think that the underlying message of your book is pretty pessimistic at the end of the day. That even if we do manage, at least seemingly, to overcome our existential threat and, I don't know, make peace or, I don't know, create a binational state or whatever other way there is that we think might end the conflict, the crisis of identity will probably remain.
I would say something that perhaps would sound a bit odd in that context. I don't think that existential crises are bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think they are quite good. I mentioned to you before the interview that famous quote from the start of Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus, about the most important philosophical question, and that is suicide. And I mentioned that that kind of idea usually take people aback. They don't want to think about those issues. But from a different perspective, this is actually a very empowering notion. Right? The fact that you have the choice. True enough, sometimes the choice is between life and death. And think about the Bible, the way that Moses is telling to the people of Israel just before he died. In the name of God, he's telling them, and I have put before you life and death, and you have chosen life. And I think the emphasis is that if we are alive, it's a choice that we are making. And for me, by underscoring the ongoing choice that we have in our life, not only if we want to live or die, but how we want to live our life, we actually see that there is much room for optimism. There is much room for changing our life for the better. Instead of saying to ourselves repeatedly, as often enough, unfortunately, we do say in Israel, that there is no choice. There is always a choice. And the key question that I wanted to raise in that book is how to remind ourselves of that choice and how to take responsibility for our own fate.
Mm-hmm. And on this inspiring note, we'll have to wrap up. Dr. Uriel Abulof, political scientist at Tel Aviv and Princeton Universities and the author of the recently published The Mortality and Morality of Nations. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, the sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
פרדה מכל הפחדים שלי זו פעם ראשונה שאני מודה והכאב הגדול שבין הצלעות שלי מחבק